Rome. The year is 897 AD inside the hallowed Basilica of St. John Lateran, the mother church of the entire Catholic world. A formal trial is in session. The city's bishops and cardinals are assembled in their solemn robes. A throne has been placed in the center of the hall for the accused. But the man seated on that throne is not breathing. He does not speak. He does not move. The defendant is a corpse, propped upright. Bloated and discolored from decay is the 9-month-old body of the former Pope, Formosus. The stench of putrefaction fills the sacred hall, a grotesque perfume mingling with the scent of incense. His decaying body has been dressed in the full, magnificent vestments of the papal offer some obscene mockery of the power he once held. Pacing before the rotting pontiff is the prosecutor, the living Pope, Stephen VI. His face is a mask of fury as he screams questions and accusations at the silent corpse. He accuses the dead man of perjury, of ambition, of violating the sacred laws of the church. And cowering behind the throne is a terrified young deacon, assigned the most surreal and horrifying task imaginable: to act as counsel for the dead. As Stephen roars his indictments, the deacon is forced to whisper meek replies on behalf of the corpse, his voice trembling in the cavernous, silent hall. The entire proceeding is a meticulously staged, theatrical performance of hatred. This was not a fevered dream. This was not a scene from a horror story. It was a real historical event, one of the most bizarre, grotesque, and macabre episodes in the entire history of the papacy. It is known as the Cadaver Synod. How did the holy heart of Western Christendom descend into such a shocking theater of desecration? What could a dead man have possibly done to warrant having his earthly remains dug up, put on trial, and subjected to such a hateful ritual? The answer is not one of madness, but of cold, calculated political vengeance. To understand the trial of the dead Pope, we must first understand the venomous, blood-soaked politics of 9th century Rome and the bitter rivalries that poisoned the very throne of St. Peter. The grotesque trial of Pope Formosus was not an act of religious fervor. It was an act of brutal, partisan politics. To understand it, we must first understand the state of 9th century Italy. The great, unifying Carolingian empire of Charlemagne had shattered. In its place, a power vacuum had emerged, and Italy had become a battleground. Ambitious kings and powerful noble families were locked in a constant struggle for control of the peninsula, and the ultimate prize in this struggle was the city of Rome. The man who controlled Rome controlled the Pope, and the Pope held the ultimate political weapon of the age, the power to crown the Holy Roman Emperor. The papacy was not just a spiritual office, it was a king-making machine. By the late 800s, two major factions were wrestling for this power: a pro-Germanic faction that looked north to the powerful kings of East Francia for patronage, and a fiercely independent Italian faction dominated by noble families like the powerful Dukes of Spoleto. Into this political viper's nest stepped Pope Formosus, elected in 891. Formosus was an experienced and ambitious diplomat who had been a major political player for decades. He inherited a papacy under the thumb of the Italian Spoletan family, who were pressuring him to crown one of their own as Holy Roman Emperor. But Formosus feared the growing power of the Spoletans and despised their candidate. Looking for a powerful counterweight, he secretly made a fateful choice. He turned north, inviting the Germanic king, Arnulf of Carinthia, to invade Italy and liberate Rome from Spoletan control. In 896, Arnulf's army marched into Rome. The Spoletans fled, and in a grand ceremony, Pope Formosus placed the imperial crown on Arnulf's head. It was a massive political victory for the Germanic faction and a humiliating, unforgivable insult to their Italian rivals. Formosus had made his choice, and in doing so, he had created enemies who would not even let him rest in his grave. Just as his victory seemed absolute, fate intervened. His new protector, Emperor Arnulf, suffered a stroke and was forced to retreat north. Shortly after, in that same year, Pope Formosus himself died. The balance of power shifted in an instant. The Spoletan faction, led by the vengeful matriarch Geltrude, stormed back into Rome. They deposed Formosus as immediate successor and installed their own man on the papal throne, a Roman nobleman who became Pope Stephen VI. Stephen was a puppet, and his Spoletan masters demanded satisfaction. But they needed more than simple revenge. They needed to erase Formosus's legacy. The entire purpose of the Cadaver Synod was a calculated, political move. If they could successfully prosecute Formosus for canonical crimes and have his papacy declared illegitimate, then all of his official acts, including the coronation of their enemy, Arnulf, would be rendered null and void. The ghoulish theater was not an act of madness. It was a brutal attempt to rewrite history by putting its author on trial, even if he was already dead. With his political goal established, Pope Stephen VI gave the order. It was a command that defied all reason and religious piety. He ordered the body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, to be exhumed. For 9 months, Formosus had rested in his sarcophagus in the crypts of St. Peter's Basilica. Now, a grim party of attendants descended into the tomb, broke it open, and hauled the decaying corpse back into the world of the living. The body was bloated, discolored, and stiff with rot. In a ghastly parody of a sacred ceremony, the attendants then had to perform the ritual of festing. The corpse, they washed the putrefying body and clothed it in the full, magnificent vestments of the papal office. They placed the silken orb and the jewel-encrusted chasuble over its decaying limbs, and put the pallium, the symbol of metropolitan authority, around its neck. Finally, the stiff, grotesquely decorated corpse was carried into the Basilica of St. John Lateran, propped upright onto a throne, and made to face its accusers. The trial began. Pope Stephen, acting as both prosecutor and judge, presided over the synod. He paced before the throne, his face contorted in a mask of rage, and began to scream his accusations at the silent defendant. The formal charges were all canonical. He accused the corpse of Formosus of perjury, of breaking oaths he had sworn. He accused him of having harbored an insatiable ambition, of illegally canvassing for the papal office, and the most serious charge, he accused him of violating a key tenet of church law by assuming the role of pope, while he was already the bishop of another city, Porto. It was a trial based on legal technicalities, but fueled by raw, personal hatred. The deacon assigned to defend the dead pope stood trembling behind the throne as Stephen roared, "When you were Bishop of Porto, why did you, in your ambition, usurp the universal Roman see?" The terrified young man could only offer a meek, whispered reply on behalf of the corpse. A farcical defense in a court of the damned. The verdict was, of course, never in doubt. The Synod dutifully found the corpse of Pope Formosus guilty on all charges. His papacy was declared illegitimate, and all of his acts, ordinances, and coronations were retroactively declared null and void. The political goal had been achieved, but for Stephen, that wasn't enough. Now, the punishment had to be carried out. This was not just a legal proceeding. It was a ritual of desecration. Papal guards approached the throne and violently tore the sacred vestments from the rotting corpse, stripping it of all holy dignity. Then, an executioner stepped forward. He took the corpse's right hand, the hand that had offered blessings to thousands of faithful Christians, and with an axe or a heavy blade, he hacked off the 3 fingers used for benediction: the index, middle, and thumb. This was the ultimate damnation, a symbolic act designed to erase Formosus's spiritual authority from the world. The trial was over. The mutilated body of the former pope was dragged from the throne and thrown out of the basilica to be disposed of like common trash. Pope Stephen and his Spolitan allies had achieved their political goal, but they had grossly miscalculated the power of public opinion and superstition. After the trial, the mutilated corpse of Pope Formosus was given one final indignity. It was dragged through the streets of Rome and unceremoniously hurled into the Tiber River, intended to be washed away and forgotten forever. But according to legend, the river refused to claim him. His body did not float out to sea. Instead, it washed up on the banks downstream, where it was discovered by a pious monk who recognized the former pope and gave the remains a secret, respectful burial. Soon, whispers began to spread through the city. Rumors claimed that the body of the martyred pope, even in its desecrated state, was now performing miracles. The sick were being healed. The blind could see. The tide of public opinion, once cowed into silence by Stephen's authority, was beginning to turn. The people of Rome began to see Formosus not as a perjurer and a criminal, but as a persecuted saint. Then, the earth itself seemed to render its judgment. Shortly after the Synod, a powerful earthquake shook the city of Rome, toppling ancient monuments and damaging buildings. Critically, the earthquake caused the roof of the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the very church where the ghoulish trial had taken place, to collapse. For the deeply superstitious populace of the 9th century, the meaning was clear, direct, and terrifying. This was not a natural disaster. This was an act of God. The heavens were expressing their fury at Pope Stephen for the blasphemous desecration he had unleashed. The murmurings of discontent among the people now grew into a roar of righteous anger. The city was on the brink of open revolt, fueled by a potent combination of political disgust, religious piety, and supernatural terror. The curse of the dead pope was no longer just a rumor. It was felt in the very trembling of the ground beneath their feet. The backlash against Pope Stephen was swift and violent. His political enemies, the supporters of the late Formosus, seized on the public outrage and the divine omen of the earthquake to foment a full-blown insurrection. The Roman mob, which had once watched the trial in fearful silence, now rose up. They stormed the papal palace, seeking vengeance for the sacrilege that had brought God's wrath upon their city. Pope Stephen VI, who just months before had wielded the power to judge the dead, now found himself a helpless captive of the living. He was overthrown, stripped of his own papal vestments in a direct, ironic echo of what he had done to Formosus, and thrown into a squalid dungeon. His reign was over. A few weeks later, his enemies ensured he would never threaten them again. Pope Stephen was strangled to death in his cell. The architect of the Cadaver Synod had met his own brutal end. A victim of the same vicious political cycle he had so grotesquely perpetuated. Justice, or perhaps revenge, had been served. The death of Pope Stephen VI did not end the chaos, it only deepened it. The city of Rome descended into a farcical and bloody power struggle, with the corpse of Pope Formosus at its center. The pope who succeeded Stephen was an enemy of the Spolitan faction. He immediately convened his own synod, which formally nullified all the verdicts of the Cadaver Synod. He ordered that the mutilated body of Formosus be recovered from the Tiber River, and in a grand ceremony, the dead pope was redressed in papal vestments and given a full, honorable reburial in St. Peter's Basilica. But just a few months later, that pope died, and a new pope, an ally of the Spolitans, came to power. He, in turn, reaffirmed the guilty verdict of the Cadaver Synod. For years, the official status of Formosus's papacy flip-flopped with each new pope, his legacy rewritten, and then erased again in a grim reflection of the city's political instability. The Cadaver Synod, in all its grotesque horror, is now seen by historians as the symbolic opening act of one of the darkest periods in the history of the Catholic Church. The century that followed is known as the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the Papacy. It was an era of profound corruption and violence, where the papal throne was no longer a spiritual office, but a secular prize to be bought, sold, and murdered for. The papacy fell under the complete control of warring aristocratic families who installed their sons, brothers, and lovers as popes. Popes were deposed, imprisoned, and assassinated with shocking regularity. The authority of the church crumbled. The ghoulish trial of Formosus, with its fusion of raw political hatred and desecrated religious ritual, was the perfect, nightmarish prologue for the century of moral decay that was to come. It is easy to look back on the Cadaver Synod and dismiss it as an act of collective madness, a bizarre, inexplicable episode from a superstitious age. But that would be to miss the point. The trial of the dead pope was not an act of insanity. It was a terrifyingly rational act of political theater. It was a calculated weapon, designed to use the most sacred symbols of faith to achieve a purely political goal, the complete and utter annihilation of an enemy's legacy. It serves as a timeless and grotesque warning about the nature of power itself. It reveals that when political hatred runs deep enough, even the sanctity of the grave is no protection. It shows how the holiest of rituals can be twisted into instruments of vengeance. And it reminds us that the insatiable thirst for power can lead men to commit acts that seem to defy all reason, leaving a scar on history that can never be erased. So, Was the Cadaver Synod a moment of pure madness or a terrifyingly logical act of political warfare? And can the dead ever truly be safe from the ambitions of the living? Share your verdict in the comments below. And to witness more of history's most bizarre and shocking chapters, make sure you subscribe to the Black Chronicle.